Disclaimer. I am not a native Latin speaker. In fact, I've only encountered the language through medieval studies. But I understand there's a decent-sized gulf between Church Latin and Ancient Latin. If I claim anything that isn't factually true, or pronounce a term that isn't correct, I would be glad to hear about it, in order to improve for the future. I would kindly ask that any corrections listed in the comments below include sources or links to reference material. Thank you. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Forge Works, and I am the Forge Meister. Join me today as we discuss the following event in history: the Pax Romana, Golden Age of Rome. Part 1. In the distant past, there was a great empire in all but name. The constant warfare of over 200 years, including skirmishes with Carthage, Macedon, the Seleucid Empire, Parthia, and the tribes of Gaul, left the Romans reeling and pining for relief. This relief came in the form of a man called Gaius Octavius, their savior from war and strife. Introduction. A Dream of Empire. Octavius, the famed scion of the Octavii household, was born on the morning of September 23rd, 63 BC, at Palatine Hill within the capital itself. He was the son of Gaius Octavius, a governor of Macedonia, and Attia, niece of none other than Julius Caesar. Our Octavius was nicknamed the Thurian. There are two possibilities for this, one of which is that his family once lived in Thurii, or because his father had quelled a slave revolt in that neighborhood shortly following his birth. This would later become an insult to his name, often by Marcus Antonius, who was Julius's adopted son. Octavius aged within the senatorial courts, and when Julius set out on campaign in Iberia, Octavius faithfully followed him despite having command over a token force, in enemy territory, and with serious illness. In the aftermath, Julius proudly named Octavius as his heir and sent him to Illyria, in preparation for another campaign on the Eastern Front. While Octavius mustered in Illyria, or Greece, Julius made a visit to Rome in the March of 44 BC. This was supposedly for him to receive honors by the Senate in light of his many victories. Instead, he was assassinated, and another civil war began. When the dust settled, only one man remained: Octavius. Julius's assassins were killed, their sympathizers disposed of. Antonius, who had once been an ally to Octavius during these wars, asserted authority over all Rome from his domain in Egypt. This last war culminated in the Battle of Actium, which saw Antonius commit suicide just days later. True rule over Rome could now begin, along with our story. Part 1. First citizen of Rome. Only Octavius remained. Any true power and authority in Rome had been invested in him, with precious little left for his subjects. That power came in the form of military might, which was something Octavius sought to remedy. He knew he could not claim the status and rank of emperor so soon after the victory over Antonius. Rather, he reformed Rome into a sort of principate, returning all powers to the Senate while making himself their principal leader. Suetonius, a renowned biographer of the initial 12 Caesars, writes that Octavius was twice tempted to return Rome fully to the status of a republic, but he never truly followed through. Octavius would, however, grant himself the title of Caesar after his great-uncle, and the Senate would propose unto him the new name of Augustus. Octavius, now Caesar Augustus, altered his appearance such that the people would think of him as the reluctant leader, rather than an eager warlord. He made a show of hesitating the honors bestowed unto him by the Senate. He took charge of unruly territories such as Iberia, Gaul, and Egypt in an effort to pacify the populace. And he made vast reforms to the Roman constitution as well as the military. Military reforms under his command were designed to bring the utmost discipline to the legions. Anyone who neglected their post, fled from the battlefield, or failed to follow orders was generally executed. At one time, the 10th Legion denied Augustus's control. He responded by disbanding the entire legion without granting them payment or property. One rebellious officer had his possessions and family sold off. His alterations to the constitution took the form of small increments, giving him ever greater control of the diminishing principate and rising empire. Over time, he was granted more permanent powers over the Senate, and he finally took upon himself the magnanimous title of Imperator, a word commonly associated with victory. Modern translations of this word include emperor. The strength of his rule relied upon his cautious and careful demeanor, but in the later years of his rule caution gave way to paranoia, and anyone, be they statesman, soldier, citizen, or slave, would be at the very least tortured should they say anything or do anything that made Augustus uneasy. His unmatched prowess as a military commander, politician, and imperator degraded, along with his ability to judge character. Augustus fell ill once more in 23 BC, and began to search for a successor in earnest. Many of those who he named his heir had a poor habit of dying before Augustus himself did, making the establishment of a permanent heir highly difficult. He finally named Tiberius successor after numerous attempts at locating a suitable heir. Tiberius was a successful general in Augustus's army, but where Augustus made shows of reluctance, Tiberius genuinely did not want the title and position of imperator. This situation could not be helped, because on the 19th of August, AD 14, Augustus chose to die by assisted suicide. These are proclaimed to be his final words. "Have I played the part well? Then applaud as I exit." The first true emperor of Rome took his final bow. Part 2. The Road to Chaos. Tiberius was a member of the Claudii lineage, and had deep political roots in the Roman patrician and plebeian classes. As a member of the Senate, he held gladiatorial games in honor of his late grandfather and father. He married the daughter of an admiral, and lived happily, until he was required by the state to divorce his wife and marry Augustus's daughter. This daughter, Julia, was notorious for her adulterous habits. When Augustus eventually committed suicide, Tiberius took his place. At first, Tiberius's policies were weakened by the fact that he did not want the throne, and so he relinquished some of his authority to the Senate, and became rather like a senator himself. He would not refer to himself as emperor until his reign was already well established. One senator is remembered to have said, "Some people are too slow to do what they promise. You are slow to promise what you have already done." With this, Tiberius resigned himself to his fate, and was required to wage war for his title of emperor. Germania, for one, revolted. Because of many more calamities, he decided to spend his last days in solitude on the island of Capreae, where he allowed every indulgence of his to take over his life. A lifelong heavy drinker, he became a drunkard, and a suppressed lover, he became a sexual deviant. He became conceited and cruel to the point that he himself recognized his own depravity and became further depressed. There are multiple accounts as to how he was killed, but the most popular rumor has it that he was smothered at the age of 77. Emperor Tiberius died on the 16th of March, AD 37, and when the citizens of Rome heard the news, they demanded that Tiberius be thrown into the Tiber River, typically a funeral reserved for criminals. While his ashes were stored in the tomb of Augustus instead, Tiberius was not granted the status of deity after his death, unlike Julius and Augustus. 2 years before his death, Tiberius completed his will, which made Caligula, the last living son of Germanicus, the new emperor. Caligula held the title of emperor for a sum total of 4 years before the Praetorian Guard assassinated him out of annoyance. It just so happened that Caligula, or Bootsy, was also very highly sexually perverse. More than that, he had a golden statue of himself erected and draped in whatever clothes he was wearing, demanded that he be treated as a deity, and subjectively had numerous subjects executed, forcing the victims' parents to witness the event. Who knew? Caligula's successor was Claudius, nephew of Tiberius. Claudius only survived as long as he did because of his physical condition. His mother described him as a man whom nature had not finished but had merely begun. Historians have concluded that Claudius was afflicted with something like polio, or cerebral palsy. His symptoms would worsen with his mood, but when calm he appeared and acted normally. He was despised by his family and held in the highest regards of ugliness and stupidity. He spent much of his early life under the safety of a cloak, so as not to stir the public, and in the company of manuscripts, to which he devoted himself fully. He was lauded during his political career for his ability to speak well and reason soundly. When the Senate looked to him for leadership, Claudius declined until the plebeians threatened to revolt and the Praetorian Guard had him crowned. This meant that much of Claudius's reign would constantly require him to legitimize his position. He had constant problems with his temper and his marriages, of which there were 4. The 4th marriage resulted in the acquisition of his heir Nero. Upon his death, most likely an assassination by his 4th wife, Claudius's mantle of leadership passed on to Nero in AD 54, an even greater deviant than Caligula and Tiberius combined. He similarly had a penchant for acting, living his entire life as if he were the protagonist of a great story with the Roman capital as its stage. Among the many eventful scenes was the Great Fire of Rome, which consumed an entire 3/4 of the capital and burned another 7 over 5 days. Nero happened to be away at the time, but it is rumored that he started the fire himself, because his next move was to build another palace over some of the cleared ground. Granted, he personally took part in the rescue efforts and organized the city to be more spacious. He also opened his own residences for public use, but as a scapegoat, he blamed a minority group known as the Christians, and took delight in executing them. At the end of Nero's reign, the Senate had grown so tired of his decadence that they finally decided to declare him an enemy of the state. He committed suicide instead of returning to the Senate for sentencing, and brought about the year of the 4 emperors. That concludes today's story. But now is the time to inspect what virtues can be forged from it. So here are the morals of the story. From Octavius we can learn the following. Change cannot be demanded, but must be facilitated. If you want someone to change, you must set the proper conditions that open them to change. Demanding that they changed, just because you want it to happen, will often make them unresponsive, or even aggressive. Try to appear humble, rather than proud. When receiving gifts or praise, it is better to feign humility than to exude pride. Humility will grant you further praise, but pride will likely condemn you. Do not become so careful that you become paranoid. Caution is good when the time is right to be cautious, but paranoia, the immediate and negative suspicion of all persons or places, can be harmful to yourself and others. From Tiberius we can learn the following. When authority and leadership are given to you, you must grab them with both hands. People are generally given power only because they've deserved it, but when they refrain from accepting it, the people depending upon them suffer and grow discontent. If you recognize there is something wrong with your character, fix it. When left alone, vices and bad habits fester into depravity and delinquency. Don't go hiding on an island if you're the one supposed to be fixing problems. This one should be pretty obvious. From Caligula, we can learn the following. If you are sexually perverse, just keep it to yourself and fix it at your next convenience. The openly perverse are typically not missed. Don't be that guy. Man is not a god. Humanity is not perfect, and that means any attempt at godhood is ultimately going to drive someone insane. From Claudius, we can learn the following. Whatever your condition, always seek an advantage. If you're disabled, seek the knowledge. If you're outnumbered and outmatched, find the bottleneck. Judgment of a person's worth by physicality alone is insufficient, because underestimation of someone's capabilities based on their appearance can see you wrong. A man with polio can still be an effective leader. He just may not be able to stand it sometimes. From Nero we can learn the following. Even if you didn't make the mess, help with the cleaning. A job well done is a fine reward in itself, and a mess well cleaned will earn you a good reputation. Short-term solutions don't solve long-term problems. Fixing issues with short-term solutions such as fixing a broken pipe with a rag and a few rolls of Scotch tape doesn't truly fix the issue. It's just stalling, until you can bring yourself to put in the required effort. Impulsive suicide is a bit of a problem, so don't give in to it, especially if it can be peacefully resolved. With the story forged and the virtues tempered, I, the Forge Meister, must conclude this analysis. I thank you for your time, and would be glad to hear from you on topics you'd like to have me present. Take care out there in the real world, because I'd like to see you return to the Forge Works.